In this lesson, we'll learn how we can organize objects using groups. Alright, now as you begin working with vector objects in your documents, as you acquire more and more of these objects and your artwork gets more and more complex, you're going to find the need to start grouping objects based on what areas they lie in. Let me go ahead and just show you an example of that. Let's go ahead and zoom in here on this artwork, and I've got here some basic shapes. I've got three ellipses with a white fill and a colored stroke applied. Then I've got three rectangle shapes with just a fill. Now let's look at these rectangles for just a moment. Now these are all pretty similar in shape, and although they have different filled colors, they're pretty similar in shape, and they're all touching. So, maybe I want to actually group these together so they operate as one entity, but there's actually three individual shapes within this group. So let's come up here to Object and choose Group, and the keyboard shortcut for that is Control-G. Now that's a keyboard shortcut I highly recommend you commit to memory because you'll be using it quite frequently, as well as ungrouping objects, which is Control-Shift-G. So I tell you what, let's go ahead and select this group now, and we know it's a group because it says group up here in the control panel, and we see the transform controls now are all at each of the four corners of the three combined objects. So we can actually transform these objects as a group now, as you can see. Now not only can we transform these objects as a group, but we can also apply appearance attributes to this group. So it'll apply those appearances to all these objects. Let's go ahead and say we wanted to apply a white stroke to these objects in this group. So with our group selected, let me come up here and select the color white. And let's just make that bigger here. Let's go ahead and make that about 3 points, 4 points, something like that. So deselect that, and you can see that it's added a white stroke to each of the objects in that group. So let's go ahead and talk about nesting groups. Now we have one group of objects here. Now we have three ellipses over here that are all fairly similar in size and shape. Let's go ahead and group these together as well. I'm going to go ahead and group those with a Control-G. Now notice with my group selected, it tells me that my group all has white fills, but there's a mixture of stroke colors. So there's question marks for our stroke preview here. Now we do again have a second group, so let's go ahead and change the position of these. Now we can move these groups around easier than we could move the individual shapes around. So let's just pull these rectangles behind these ellipses. Let's go ahead and pull all of them over here. And now let's create another group that includes these two groups that we've already created. Let me go ahead and just drag a marquee around these. Let's go ahead and hit a Control-G again. So now both of these groups exist within one parent group, so to speak. What we've done is we've nested those two initial groups inside one bigger group. So we could nest groups inside Illustrator. Now you might be wondering, well, how can I modify these objects without taking them out of their group? We know how to ungroup these with a Control-Shift-G, and if we do that once, you'll see that we're back to the initial groups that we first created here. Just pull those apart. Let me undo that. And now we're still back at our main group. We can actually edit the objects in these groups by going into what's known as isolation mode. Now isolation mode can be entered in a couple of different ways. We can actually double click on the group itself, and you're going to see this gray bar appear up at the top of our work area. Now there's some icons here. Now there's a little arrow here that will back us out of this isolation mode. If we move to the right of that, we're going to see what layer our artwork is currently sitting on. Now we haven't talked about layers yet, but we will in the next lesson. To the right of that, you can see that we are currently in a group. Now the reason why it's telling us that we're in a group is because we can actually enter into isolation mode from more objects than just a group. But I'll show you that here in just a moment. Let's go ahead and back out of this and look at another way we can enter into isolation mode. We can also enter in simply by right-clicking on this group and saying isolate selected group. That'll take us to the exact same spot. Now exiting out of this group, we can, like I mentioned before, we can back out simply by clicking that arrow twice, or we can simply double click anywhere on the artboard or scratch area around our group. So let me do that here. And one other way to enter into isolation mode for a group is simply to click this button right here on your control panel. This will isolate a selected group as well. So again, several different ways to enter into isolation mode. Really doesn't matter how you get there, as long as you know that in isolation mode, what we can do now is we can come in and select the two groups that exist inside this parent group, and we can actually even drill down even further into isolation mode. I'll tell you what, let me just double click on the ellipses group right here. I'll just double click on that. And you can see that another group icon has been added up here in our gray bar, indicating that we've entered into a nested group. So you can sort of see how we've drilled down into this group, and now we can select the individual objects. Let's just go ahead and zoom in on this. Maybe we want to just move up the ellipses here towards the top of the rectangles. And let's move this one down to the bottom. And let's go ahead and exit out of isolation mode just by double clicking here away from our objects. Now I mentioned before we can actually enter into isolation mode for more objects or more types of objects than just groups. Now we can actually enter into isolation mode for layers, for sublayers, and for individual paths. Now we'll talk about layers in the next lesson again, but let me just come in and show you how we can enter into isolation mode for a path. So I've got this individual object selected here. We see that it has sort of a teal stroke and a white fill. Let me just double click on the path itself. You can see here we've added yet another icon up in the top gray bar, and it says the word path next to it. It has a little different icon to it. So now we've isolated just that path. So that's one example of another type of object we can enter into isolation mode for. Let me go ahead and exit out here. And let me just show you how I have used groups in the logo that we've been working with. Let's go ahead and come down here, and I've broken this logo up into the individual components of it. You can see here. We've got our character, we've got the background wood stump, we've got the word Woody's, and the word barbecue with a couple little footprints around it. Now, I know that each one of these clusters of vector objects is actually a group. So let me just come in and grab our character here. I'll zoom in nice and tight on him, and we can see that he's actually a group. So if I were to actually ungroup him with a Control-Shift-G, you can see here that we can pull apart all the individual shapes that make up our character. Quite a few little shapes to keep track of. So you can see how fast we accumulate large numbers of vector shapes when we're really building objects in Illustrator. So let me just undo those two. And let me just show you how I'll undo all the way back to where he is still a group. We can actually grab our direct selection arrow with the keyboard shortcut A. And while these objects are grouped together, we can go ahead and click on the group and select individual objects within that group. So we don't have to necessarily enter into isolation mode to select objects, but it's going to be a lot easier to manipulate objects if you go into isolation mode. Plus, it gives you a nice visual of that gray bar at the top of your screen. Now, being that each one of these different clusters of vector objects are grouped together here, like the word Woody's and this stump, in the logo that is at the top of our letterhead here, each one of these groups have been grouped into one parent group. Now, let me show you how you can select those subgroups inside that parent group using what's known as the group selection tool. Now, we hit on this earlier when we were talking about our selection tools, and we mentioned that it's underneath our direct selection tool, but we can actually use a modifier key to get to it from that direct selection tool by simply holding down the Alt key. Now, let me go ahead and come in here and show you how to use this. We've got 4 subgroups within this parent group. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on our character here. I'm going to click on him once and then twice. And you can see here that we select everything in that subgroup. So we haven't entered into isolation mode, but we've selected an entire subgroup here. And we can do that for any of these subgroups. So let me just go ahead and click here once, twice, and we've selected that entire wood stump. So you can kind of see how the group selection tool works and how we can select nested groups using this tool. Alright, so in this lesson we have learned how to group objects together and manage groups using isolation mode. So go ahead at this point, Experiment with grouping some different objects together and nesting some groups inside other groups. When you come back, we'll talk about the layers panel.